Good evening, everybody. Welcome back. We hear countless times in the gospel that the Sanhedrin wanted to remove Jesus. They're the religious leaders. Jesus is coming up with a whole new understanding of Judaism. They have a very clear notion of what the Messiah was going to do. You have to understand just the way they lived. You know, one of the problems we have now in the Mideast, when someone says, well, who do you think is right, Israel or Palestine? Well, on what level? Because this is an area that even before Christ had political governments, religious governments. Are we talking about an historical right to property? Are we talking about a spiritual right to property? Are we talking about something geographical? Are we talking about something religious? There are so many aspects to any question about what's going on in the Mideast, and we get caught up with that even here at the crucifixion, because there's so many different levels of leadership. I don't know if anybody got to see the film. It was not really in theaters very long. It was called A Stranger Among Us. And basically, it was the story of a murder that takes place in the Diamond District. And the murder, but a lot of money was missing, the diamonds were missing, and you know, it was within the Hasidic Jewish community, within the Hasidic Jewish merchants. Now, the NYPD wants to investigate, but the Hasidic Jews have their own ways of handling these things. And it just really kind of talks about the conflict that goes on, not so much between the police department and the Hasidic Jews, but what goes on within the heart of this one detective in particular, who happened to be played by Melanie Griffith. And as all of a sudden she's being assigned to this case, and she's realizing she is in a whole different world. You know, there's one of the first introductory scenes where, you know, you see this big, dark room, just the dark wood paneling and bookshelves all over the place, and there's this tremendous desk. And sitting behind this big desk is an even bigger rabbi who's just sitting there with his arms, you know, over his chest. And Melanie Griffith walks in, and her hair is in a little red bob, and her skirt is up to her navel, and she's highly made up with a little black dot painted on her face, and she has the sling purse, and she's sashaying back and forth with her badge, you know, pinned to the strap of her purse. And she goes in and she kind of looks around the place. She's chewing on a piece of gum. She sits down in the chair. She crosses her legs and she looks at the rabbi and she says, "So, who's in charge around here?" And without missing a beat, he looks at her and says, "The Almighty is in charge here." And as he says that, all of a sudden, this very simple woman who he didn't even see standing there comes from up against the wall, puts a blanket over Melanie Griffith's legs, and then just steps back. And you know how they can do it so well in the movies? You just watch her face change. And she's saying, "Where am I? And what did I get myself into?" But that kind of complicated governmental system was even present in the time of Christ. The Romans owned the area. It was part of the Roman Empire. So of course, the one who's going to be in charge of everything is going to be Caesar. He's going to have people there. And the land was divided into 4 parts, and there were procurators in charge of each part. Now, Herod would have been kind of the chairman of the group there, the head procurator, and he was around at the time. But the particular governor that would have been there was Pontius Pilate. But realistically speaking, although the Jews are the major part of the population, they're not the only population. And you know what? You have your laws among yourselves. As long as there's no problem, I'm not going to interfere. I'm not going to try to fix what isn't broken. So, you'll call on me if you need me, but I'm not going to step in. You're having a problem between two rabbis, work it out yourselves. Now, if it gets to be something major, then you're going to have to call in the Roman authorities. The Jewish authorities formed the Sanhedrin, and they were the ones who would have decided what was and was not the law, what was and was not permissible according to their law. Joseph of Arimathea was part of the Sanhedrin. Nicodemus would have been part of the Sanhedrin. They were well-respected Jews. They don't come out of hiding until after the crucifixion. The Sanhedrin is going to be a little bit divided, but Jesus is not preaching a party line. Their expectation is that the Messiah is going to come and liberate them from Roman authority, give them their kingdom as Jews here on earth. And then they're going to be able to grow and grow and grow into this powerful nation. Jesus is talking about a kingdom that is not of this world. Jesus is talking about a kingdom that will be the reward for a life of service and sacrifice. Jesus is talking about the necessity of a cross. They don't know what he's talking about when he says, in 3 days, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it back up. They think he's talking about Solomon's temple, and they're saying, this thing took so many years to build. You're going to do it in 3 days? That's why we heard at the end of Sunday's gospel, the disciples, after he rose from the dead, understood he was talking about the temple of his body. So you have a very complex situation going on here. You have a religious council, the Sanhedrin, hoping for a political Messiah. You also have a government that's above you, but not interested in your internal affairs. But if you're going to start talking insurrection, they're going to have to step in. And that's going to end up being used, because the Sanhedrin are going to have to rely on Jesus said he is the King of the Jews. That when asked, are you the King of the Jews? He did not deny it. And we're going to hear that throughout this trial, because the Sanhedrin is going to say, we have no king but Caesar. So now, if Pilate or Herod were to say, oh, but you could have him, well, now they're the ones who are being disloyal, because now they're being disloyal to Caesar. And they're not going to do that. Meanwhile, the Sanhedrin is not going to want to be the ones who are going to put Jesus to death for several reasons. One of them is fear and doubt. But the other is also because now you have all of these Jews who are following him. He is doing remarkable things that they can't explain. They are frightened by what they don't understand. And they don't want to be the ones to be responsible for this. We'll see next week when we talk a little bit about the apostles and Judas. When Judas goes to return the money, they refuse to accept it back, because then the responsibility for the death of Jesus would have been back on them. And they're very much saying, we're not going to be the ones who put this man to death. So they have to get this out of their own domain and back into the domain of the Romans. So they say, he called himself a king. We have no king but Caesar. You crucify him. And they get the answer back, crucify him yourselves. You do it. They can't. Now they come back with that, we don't have the authority to put someone to death. Does that sound strange? Stone a woman caught in adultery. Is that not putting someone to death? So the Lord does allow them to put someone to death. But not when the Roman procurator is in town and Herod was there. So they could not, because then their death penalty would have overstepped their authority, because the Romans did not allow them to put someone to death, especially for something political, if their authority was present. And since Herod and Pilate were both there, they could not take that upon themselves. It's a simple codice in the law, but it becomes a very important one, because now they have to get the Roman authorities involved, and they have to bring this then into the hands of Pilate. And Pilate, I think for us, is one of the most important figures in the whole looking at the Passion, because Pilate is the one where we see most clearly the anxiety that someone goes through deciding whether or not they believe in Jesus. The Roman trial begins with Pilate, where Pilate gives him some initial questions. Then Pilate sends Jesus to Herod. He uses a very simple trick. You're Herod's race. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but he was a Nazarene. He was a Galilean. So since they were in Jerusalem, Herod was in charge of Galilee. Pilate uses oh no, you might be a Jew living and working here, but we have to have a change of venue because you're a citizen there. Very much like if someone from New Jersey commits a crime in New York, well, where are they going to be tried? They could ask for a change of venue to someplace where they're not known, if it's a serious crime. If not, they're going to be tried where the crime is committed. But if it's going to be something major, something serious, they could say, well, bring me someplace where I'm not known. Or the lawyers will say, you can't have a media frenzy. You've got to take him someplace where we could do this without all those disruptions. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. After that, he goes back to Pilate. And then a lot of all of the different surrounding trial effects begin to take place. At that initial questioning before Pilate, Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answers simply, "You say that I am." As a title, calling him the King of the Jews is constantly put on the lips of non-Jews. That's how the Romans have come to see him. The Romans have come to see him as obviously the strongest leader within the Jewish community. After that, especially in St. Mark's Gospel, Jesus uses silence, and he uses silence very regally. I'm above this. But what it's really saying is, what Jesus' silence is denoting is, it's already set. This is going to happen. So why are we even going through this pretense? Why are we going through this charade that maybe I'm not going to be crucified? We know that I am. So at this point, I don't have to answer you anymore. But Pilate is going to keep going after him. Don't you know who I am? Don't you know the authority I have? Don't you know what I can do or can't do? All we hear is that Peter's silence, or Jesus' silence, causes Pilate to wonder, giving the implication that Pilate is beginning to experience some type of conversion. We can believe that he's at least in somehow awed by Christ's presence. He sees this man bravely standing there before him, not making excuses, not making up stories, not making up lies, but he sees this man standing there and intensely just simply saying, I'm going through with this. Luke has the Gentile audience. He doesn't want them to be offended. He doesn't want the non-Jews to feel like we're not welcome within this Christian community. Luke's whole point in writing his gospel is we want to bring these Gentiles in and let them know that salvation is for everybody. So his picture of Pilate is going to be very much emphasizing the fact that Pilate's becoming a believer. But the Sanhedrin is putting him into a position where he's got to follow the letter of the law. And that's always going to be a difficult position for someone who's in authority. It's always going to be a difficult position for someone who has to make a decision where they know someone else's future is at stake. But when push comes to shove, that person in authority is going to have to follow the letter of the law, and Pilate's being pushed into that. Now, all the Gospels will have Pilate looking weak, for want of a better word, but probably a better word would be just confused. He's in an inner turmoil. He doesn't quite know which way to turn. And the most elaborate expression of that is in John's Gospel. John's Gospel, when it comes to talking about Jesus before Pilate, could very easily put onto a stage. But you would need to have a stage with two parts. The inner praetorium would have been where Jesus and Pilate met. And there would have been nobody else there except maybe a couple of Pilate's closest advisors and some soldiers. But then he'd go from talking to Jesus alone in the praetorium, he would step outside and be with the crowds. And when he's outside with the crowds, it's, well, what should I do with him? And they're saying, crucify him. And he's, well, no, let me go talk to him some more. And he's back into Jesus. Do you know what I have in my hands? Do you know that I hold your life? Can't you just say this? Can't you just tell me you are not again? Jesus just steps back. And then he goes back out into the praetorium. When he's just with Jesus, he's almost pleading Jesus to give him a reason to say no. He's pleading with Jesus, seemingly because he's in awe of this man in whom he's coming to believe. If nothing else, he knows that this man is a superior to the prophets. And Jesus' bearing is always kingly, always elegant, always regal. Then he goes back out to the crowds. And we see in this man who's supposed to be this leader, this inability to actually make his decision. 3 times he hears from Jesus, "My kingdom is not of this world." But that's bringing us to another level, a level with which Pilate is not familiar. Pilate is not going to be familiar with Jesus and his concept of the kingdom. That's when he says, "You're Herod's race. You're a Galilean. Go to Herod." Only in St. Luke's Gospel does Jesus go to Herod. Now, Luke's Gospel would have been very much familiar with Roman law. The Jews couldn't have cared less about it. Unless they could use it for their benefit at the time, as they did by sending Jesus to Pilate, they had their own rules, they had their own regulations, they had their own society that was working fine. If you just stay out of it, we're fine. You know, we saw that, frankly, just a couple of years ago over in Williamsburg. The Hasidic Jewish community there has their own structure. They take care of everything that they need to take care of within their own community. When was there a clash? COVID. When all of a sudden, no. For this service, we have to have 1,000 people out in the street. And the police department, fire department was saying, "No, you're not going to have 1,000 people in the street." And they're saying, no, don't you worry about us. We're fine. We're just taking care of this ourselves. And it was, no, you're not. And that's where we saw the clash. That's very much the type of clash we have here with the Jewish law and the Roman law coming together. Herod is not going to do anything. Herod is just now wanting to meet Jesus. But isn't it interesting? In St. Luke's Gospel, in chapter 13, some Pharisees go to Jesus and say to him, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." And he said to them, "Go and tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and the 3rd day I finish my course. Nevertheless, I go on my way today and tomorrow." 10 chapters later, when Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but he made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by vehemently accusing him, and Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt. They mocked him, but in the end they sent him back to Pilate. But we hear that Pilate goes from, as the Pharisees reported it to Jesus, wanting to kill him, to Herod, who wanted to see him for a long time, in the hope that he would wish him to see some sign. Now, had the Pharisees made that up to try to frighten Jesus away, to try to silence him, to try to stop him? Did Herod really want to kill him the way they told Jesus? Or was that just a ploy to get him away from them, to get him to leave? Or did Herod, hearing that Jesus had been arrested, somehow have a change of heart? Well, that time wouldn't have been there for that change of heart. But we certainly know that when Herod finally did meet him, he was a bit awestruck in his presence. Both Herod and Pilate attest to the innocence of Jesus. Both of them say, "We find in him no reason to call him guilty. And if you find no reason to call him guilty, then you're declaring him innocent. They both say, we have no reason to put him to death. And as we're going to see, we have to pair this with Judas hanging himself after he goes back to the Sanhedrin. The bottom line is that although they both say they have no reason to put Jesus to death, the bottom line is written, and Jesus is going to go to the cross. So Pilate, with Jesus back in the praetorium, has him scourged. And then he refers back to a custom. Now, what we don't know is if the custom was Jewish or Roman. The custom in honor of the holidays of releasing a prisoner. Now, the scourging was something brutal. We talked about that the first night. It wasn't just a little whip lashing, but that whip had pieces hanging from it and pieces of barbed wire on it, so that each lash was more like 3 or 4 or 5 lashes. Picture then what Jesus must have looked like. He's already bloody. Those lashes are not just going to be on his back. And it's going to be his back, his legs, across his chest from where it wraps around. Jesus has already been awake for who knows how many hours, probably close to 35 or so hours by this time. And it's been brutal going back and forth, Herod to Pilate, the Sanhedrin. He's wearing the crown of thorns. And Pilate says, there is the tradition that in honor of the feasts, one prisoner gets released. So he takes out Barabbas. Now, we don't know much about Barabbas, except that the man was a notorious criminal, probably evoking the same spirit among the people that Charles Manson would among us. And he takes out Jesus. And he has the two of them stand there. Which one should I release? He's playing on their humanity. He's playing on their sympathy. He's opting for the fact that they're going to say, this man has suffered enough. Let him go. He's opting on the fact that they're not going to be stupid people. And they're not going to want this hardened criminal back in their presence. This man is stealing, murdering, whatever he's doing. This other man is curing, teaching. So Pilate is taking that gamble that people are going to clearly say, Jesus suffered enough, let him come back among us. And they're not going to want Barabbas there. And to his surprise, what did they scream? Give us Barabbas. We want him. Free him, not Jesus. And Pilate doesn't know what to do. So he's back in the praetorium with Jesus. And then he's back with the crowds. And that's when there's one little scene that takes place. And we only hear about it in Matthew's gospel. This is how it reads. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seats, while he's sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much over him today in a dream." The only one that mentions that is Matthew. Now, we don't know anything really about Pilate's wife, except that she's Pilate's wife. What we can presume is that since he was stationed there, there's a probability, because most of those governors would have taken Jewish women as their wives. So she was probably a Jewess. So what was this that she heard in the stream? "I have a troubling dream about him." Maybe she had a vision that he really is the King of the Jews, that he really is the Messiah. Maybe she had some type of sense. You know, Father Wilson read a beautiful story that gave the implication that the dream was actually inspired by Satan, because Satan knew that he would be overthrown by the cross. And the only way Satan could keep his power was to not allow the cross to happen. So he went through Pilate's wife to try to get her to convince Pilate to say no to the crucifixion, which, since the procurator was in town, the Jews could not overrule. But whatever it is, it's a sign that she is becoming a person of faith in Jesus, and she's trying to tell Pilate, "You're in over your head. Don't hurt this righteous man," which now only adds even more to Pilate's confusion and his wondering. They're constantly saying, "We find nothing to say that this man is guilty." And then finally, Pilate caves. Pilate caves in. He says to the crowds, "What evil has he done? Of what crime is he guilty?" Matthew has him actually wash his hands and say, "I am innocent of this man's blood." And the response that comes from the Jewish people is, "Then let his blood be on us and on our children." On our children. Prophetic words to what's going to be going on in the church after the resurrection, to what's going to be going on within the people of God for those years to come. But ultimately, Pilate listens not to his own heart. Pilate does not listen to his own mind, but Pilate listens to the cries of the Jews and sends Jesus off for crucifixion. And then the way of the cross begins. The scriptures tell us that both Herod and Pilate found nothing guilty in Jesus. There was no crime with which they could charge them. From what they knew, he was King of the Jews. He certainly was the Jew who was getting the most attention in that whole community. He was certainly doing wonderful, good things for the people, yet their leaders are still saying, "He said he's a king. He broke your law." But we're saying we're not calling him guilty. You do this. We can't do this. You have to do this. So ultimately then, who's going to be responsible for the death penalty of Jesus? The Sanhedrin is calling for it. It can't be done without the okay of the Roman governor. Can he wash his hands of that decision? Can he wash his hands of that guilt? Does the blood fall upon the Jews and their descendants? Well, as Christians, if we look at it, the Jews were certainly involved. The Romans were certainly involved. The crowds were certainly involved. Pilate was certainly involved. Herod was certainly involved. None of them would stop and say, no, don't do this. And any of them could have pulled the plug on this at any time. But then if we think of the reason for the crucifixion to begin with, going back to Pontius Pilate, we find the answer in Jesus' silence, because in Jesus' silence is the realization. And it's going to end up being the bottom line at the Soup and Scripture Supper. It's going to be the realization that Jesus knows this is necessary for the salvation of the world, that Jesus knows that for the forgiveness of sins, the perfectly innocent lamb has to be offered on the cross. And being that perfectly innocent lamb, Jesus is silent because at any moment, Jesus could have stopped it. At any moment, he could have said, okay, I'm not the king of the Jews. At any moment, he could have called on his Father and said, end this. But he doesn't. Because Jesus' regal attitude, his silence, is the acknowledgement that this must happen. Because to atone for all the sins of the world, to open the gates of the kingdom of heaven, to be the Savior of the world, then this cross has to be carried and the crucifixion has to be complete. So who crucified Jesus? Well, on one level, all of us. All of us. Because it's by sinful disobedience that the cross and the perfect sacrifice became necessary. But on another level, no one. Because Jesus freely took the cross upon himself, and he accepted it as his Father's will. Especially St. John is going to say, don't worry about blaming who did it. Just be grateful that it happened, and your sins are forgiven, and the gates of heaven are open. Pilate is a wonderful metaphor for the doubt of every human being. Pilate is a wonderful metaphor for those days when we say, are you listening to me? Are you really there? Do you hear me? What do I do? Are you who I think you are? What do you want of me? Why aren't you answering me? Pilate's indecision is the challenge to face our own indecision, the challenge to face our own doubts and our own fears, and then to hear, no, he is the King of the Jews. But isn't it interesting? Pilate, who is so wishy-washy, as we saw with the centurion, Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, after the carrying of the cross, when Jesus gets to the cross, at the cross, Pilate finds courage, and he puts a sign over his head that said, the King of the Jews. And when the Sanhedrin says to him, no, you should put, he said, I'm the King of the Jews, Pilate says, what I wrote, and makes his only definitive statement of faith in Jesus. Again, because he feels the effects of the noble suffering of Jesus and begins to see in him not one destined for suffering and pain, but he sees in him one noble enough to accept the pain on behalf of others. Why don't we take a break before we come back to the way of the cross?